So Warren, I see Hanairo, Shaw, Urban, and Giebert.
Okay. And the first item of business then is
Minutes from June.
from June, right? The minutes from the June meeting need a motion for approval.
I'll move approval.
I'll second. This is Lisa.
All in favor, say aye.
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 I wasn't there, so I can vote.
Aye.
So I don't know if that's enough for approval. It doesn't. for
That
what-
works. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, what's the first item of business then?
Operating budgets. So there is not, for those of you who are unfamiliar, we've had the same dollar amount for an operating budget for several years now. And it's comprised of a few things. This first item is something we pay to Dane County, really, and they do, we have a group permit with them. And they fund a staff position and do outreach and education and things like that. If you guys saw a notice come through today about adopt a storm drain, that's coming from this effort, really. That's a kind of a Dane County program that we're partnering with them on. Second item is our stormwater permit fee. That's constant. Third item is stream gauge monitoring for the gauge just downstream of Confluence Pond. Third item is something we're required to do by our fourth item by our WPDS permit. And we've traditionally hired Chuck Nod to do that work, both the fourth and the fifth item. And the sixth item is just kind of a, tiny little slush fund that was originally intended for us to hire a consultant to help us with some enforcement efforts. But I think it's just been winnowed down to almost nothing now. So bottom line, there's not a lot of changes to this from last year.
Yep.
Since we're talking about adopt the storm drain, you mentioned it. Can we talk about that? The
Yeah.
county's program. Yeah. I got the letter in the email. So how's it going to be distributed to just members? How are you going to pick out an email list to join?
Well, they sign up through a county web application, and they can pull up a map that has all of the inlets in the city on it and pick an inlet. And then the county will send them an email and tell them to come to City Hall and pick up a kit. And a kit is really a 5-gallon bucket, a broom and dustpan, a safety vest, and some stickers. And those are sitting in my cube right now.
Hey, there's Ken.
Yeah, hi, sorry I'm late.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
missed
I'm-
swab.
I had a little health issue, but it's taken care of
Uh-oh.
now.
It's good.
So how are residents going to know about this program?
There's going to be more advertisement, Warren, aside from that little email. It'll be available through the county, and we're putting something up on Facebook, and there's some various means of communicating it.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a good idea. I don't know how effective it'll be, but one thing I did notice is they talked about preventing flooding, and I think that's a little overstatement, but
Yeah,
I don't think it's going to prevent floods, but it's something doing in the right direction. Will help with phosphorus loads if you get rid of the leaves and debris.
I think I inserted the term local flooding into the template letter.
Yeah. Okay. That was just a question I had.
I've had 4 people have signed up so far.
Eric, what's the deadline for signing up?
No deadline.
Okay, because I send a monthly e-news to the residents of District 6, and I'll definitely make sure I put that in. I'll also talk to some of my neighbors on this street, Whittlesey, about signing up, and I
Yeah.
plan to as well.
Yeah, it's just ongoing. The county had a few communities, piloting it for the last couple of years, and now it's expanded. I think maybe there's 5, 6 communities that are in.
Could we put something like that on the neighborhood site? Or next door, wherever it's called?
I think so. Yeah. And honestly, I'm enlisting Abby and Kelly Hilliard to help me with the social media stuff because I'm a dinosaur.
Or the Friends of Pheasant Branch would probably be another source for finding people.
Certainly. Yeah, I can make that.
I'll ask my neighbor if he's got a drain, and so do I. So we both could have buckets.
And you can adopt more than one if you want.
Oh, good. So what do we need on this one, Eric? We need a motion for approval?
Can I ask one more question before we get to that point? And that is about the public information and education. Eric, you said that amount had been whittled down. Is there a need for additional funding, like to hire an intern, or, we have a chance to ask for a little bit more, especially if the budget hasn't changed year after year?
Yeah, there is a need for more funding, certainly. I think we're asking for a new position, Lisa, down in engineering. And operations have made a request for several years for a field position that would be either fully or mostly allocated to stormwater maintenance. We're kind of asking for the same thing, another engineer that would free up, some time for Rich and I to dedicate to stormwater essentially. But that should be included in the budget process now. And no, to correct you, the last number is the one that's been just slowly shrinking away.
Oh, okay.
That's in regards to, a private site executes an agreement with us that promises they'll maintain their detention pond forever and ever. And every 2 years, they're supposed to certify that with us. And, we've only had that program up and running for maybe 6 years. And so far, we haven't taken any enforcement action. That's really where that goes. And I think we would have the authority that would be charged back to those site owners. So this would only cover some overhead costs to hire somebody.
Okay.
Short answer is sure, we could use more funding.
Maybe before we go to the voting, maybe I should clarify for new members, Lisa and David, that third item, Dane County water quality monitoring. It's really stream flow and water quality monitoring. It's for the gauging station operated by the U.S. Geological Survey.
Yeah, I was going to say most of these are pretty much, ongoing agreements, and there's really not much you can change on these things. So it's pretty straightforward and pretty minimal in my book. So I'll even go ahead and make a motion to approve this.
Okay, do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? The motion's carried.
Item 3 is capital budget warrant. Now, some of this should look familiar and some of it has been kind of switched around. And some of it's really, up in the air until we get results back from EOR with their floodplain analysis, or at least this is my recommendation. So
The only one we're really committed to is the adaptive management one, right?
right, we're stuck with that. The rest of these are all kind of decision items. So the second one is what I would anticipate to get rolling with formal flood mapping review and approval from DNR and FEMA over the next couple of years. And then we're into projects which are the same as this body has seen before, but all, like I'm saying, all kind of subject to the results of what, you know, we think may be most appropriate for flood mitigation. And I even put just a dummy project in there to represent that, the fifth one down.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about that.
And even south pond dredging could be handled, will probably more likely be handled by stormwater utility funding, right?
Well, you know, we're not proposing to use fees in lieu for this, which is really
Okay.
our only segregated source of funding. These are just capital project recommendations, and yes, certainly some of it could end up coming out of SWUB.
Right, that's the argument we had before. That the dredging, the SWUB would take care of the maintenance portion of it, and if we wanted to enlarge it to enhance flood reduction or water quality trapping, it would probably come from this budget. Is that right?
No, I think we're a lot more free with what we can do with the SWUB funds now.
I think so too. Hope so.
Well, we got council recommendation on that last year too.
Oh, is that right?
And Lisa, I think you're new to this, but there was traditionally finance committee did not want to spend stormwater utility funds on anything except maintenance of large facilities, which caused a lot of roadblocks, basically.
South pond was one of them.
And so you're saying council changed that guidance, or that's still the guidance?
Council agreed with what I gave them last year, which basically said there weren't any projects that did not involve some element of improvement as opposed to purely maintenance. And they also approved maintenance of things like ditches. I can find all that and send it to you.
Okay, thanks.
But the alder who was driving all that is no longer with us.
Okay, so what do we need on this one? Motion for approval?
Yeah, to recommend to finance and council.
I'll make that motion.
Do we have a second?
I'll second it. This is Lisa.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Okay, the motion is carried.
Item 4, Warren, is request for recommendations from planning and zoning staff. And I wrote you guys a memo about this, and hopefully you had the chance to read that and did not try to like dig into the statutes or anything like that. Just quickly fall asleep.
Yeah, right.
And Mark Opus is here too, who can answer some of these questions. There's basically, we're in the process of rewriting the whole zoning ordinance, and I think Plan Commission looked at that for the first time last week. Is that correct, Mark?
The Plan Commission is starting to look at some additional concepts that don't get into the technical details of what are before you tonight. So they didn't get into any of the topics that Eric outlined in his memo. But it's just, with the draft is still, it's still in draft form and still being drafted. It hasn't had, most of it has not had any public, hasn't published yet, if you will. So there's some of these tables and some of these concepts now are published, but it's because we want your input as we continue working on the draft.
Okay.
So
So
it
there's-
doesn't include anything about the floodplain though. That's separate.
That's separate, yeah. That's a separate ordinance that we have. So basically, actually, Eric, I haven't given you this feedback, but I thought you did a very, very good job. In fact, I learned some things from your memo. So I really appreciate that. You did a very nice job with an overview. So as he noted, floodplain is separate, but we have the environmental corridors have always been through land division. It was referenced there, but this is a proposal to make them incorporate them as an overlay zoning district, which then means a parcel that doesn't involve land division. So if somebody wants to redevelop their property and they're not doing any land division, under current ordinance, there are maybe other things that can affect their ability to develop in an environmental corridor, but the environmental corridor, the existence of that in and of itself would not come to have any bearing. With this new ordinance, that would be, if it were mapped as an environmental corridor, then that would carry some regulatory power. So I don't know how you want to go through this, Eric or Warren, because I think that's why the memo that Eric put together really is fleshing out the concepts, and we wanted your feedback, especially on the shoreland questions that he asked. I'm especially interested in that policy discussion.
Yeah, so these two overlay districts, there's environmental corridors, which is kind of all encompassing and would include floodplain stuff, but we also will still have our own floodplain ordinance, which, does a fine job of restricting development within the floodplain, et cetera. And then the second one is the more complicated question, and that has to do with shorelands, shoreline wetlands, and setbacks and impervious area standards and all kinds of things. So I separated these out for you guys, and there were two things I was looking for comment on regarding the environmental corridors, and that was some separation distances. And then the second one is, what do we do with non-navigable waterways? And kind of the example here, which most of you should be familiar with, is Bell Farm. And there was a draw or a drainage way that ran north-south through that, proposed development. And Carpsey had it mapped as an environmental corridor, but when DNR gave us a determination of non-navigability, then that environmental corridor just kind of vanished.
Yeah.
So if we took an extra step and identified these ourselves, Van de Waal had sent over something that they had done for Lake Geneva, where they had pulled in other GIS layers, some from USGS, some from the Southeast Regional Planning Commission. That's the kind of flexibility I'm asking about. I don't really see a lot of spaces where this is going to come into play, other than the example I just gave you. But it's possible that in the future, you know, we annex some land or something like that, that butts up against another drainage way. So those are the two main questions here. And the separation distances that I was asking about, don't have those bookmarked. But, you know, one of the environmental corridors will be steep slopes. And typically, a developer will be told, do not, you know, disturb the steep slopes. This would actually set setback from the steep sloped area. Whoops, I think I'm past it.
So what would you like from us, Eric?
Well, a recommendation, whether or not you're good with using the environmental corridor overlay district. Which is probably a pretty simple decision. And then a recommendation of whether or not it's worth pursuing, including non-navigable waterways as one of the elements of the environmental corridor.
Eric, can you explain the advantages and disadvantages of doing that, including the non-navigable?
Well, the whole point of these is to protect, you know, sensitive areas, either sensitive from the standpoint of you don't want to disturb them. You know, there's other things included in here like archaeological sites, but those are also covered through statute. You know, part of it is habitat, greenway kind of stuff where we're trying to provide continuous corridors for wildlife and, you know, amphibians to travel and live. The only difference between a navigable and a non-navigable is exemplified by that Bell Farm site.
Which is, DNR says is non-navigable now.
Yes.
Yeah, but I strongly support this because flooding you can have severe flooding in a non-navigable situation. You know, it's just, there's no base flow, that's all. And so I'm with you on this, Eric.
So just to bring this back up, this is the drainage way I'm talking about. If you can follow my
Yeah,
cursor here. So if this had remained navigable, this would have had to basically stay in place with this development, and they would have had to, everything would have drained through it. You know, the ponds that they're building for the site would have probably ended up adjacent to it, you know, and then there would be setbacks preventing impervious area from encroaching in there. And what we have now is they're going to intercept this drainage way and they're going to pipe it down to a point right about here. And then they release it and their ponds are situated right in here. You know, but from an environmental standpoint, you're losing this connectivity. Anytime you fill up the natural draw, you're kind of increasing your chances of having a flooding problem down the road.
Absolutely.
So if we make this recommendation now to include non-navigable, is that going to have an impact on the development as it's planned, or would that, I mean,
No,
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I don't think it's gonna make a difference for this, but I think in the future, I would lean towards being more protective rather than less.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I kind of like it being deemed navigable. It seems to make more sense to me.
Say again, what was,
So Ken, you thought it was better make it non-navigable?
I think we needed, maybe I'm a little confused, but something that's not navigable can still be a big flood risk, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think the question is, do we limit it to navigable drainage ways or include the non-navigable ones
Yeah.
too? And I would say we do both.
Oh, yeah, right.
Correct.
I mean, yeah, in Arizona, there's lots of streams that are big flood risks that have no water in them for almost all the time. So, I mean, I realize it's not Arizona, but we still have similar issues. So,
Well, South Fork,
yeah, that's right.
South Fork is dry.
Yeah.
And then this would give us more certainty because we wouldn't have to adjust if DNR changes their designation for a drainage way.
Right, right.
Yeah, that's really the difference, is that we would have this mapped and identified on our own, and we would not be dependent on an outside agency.
Yep, yep. No, it's good work, yeah.
Eric, can we go back to the steep slope area for a little bit? I guess I missed that. How was the steep slope area defined, and what was the proposed setback on that?
I think the setback was, I can't find it. I'm sorry, David.
Oh.
I think it was 10 feet, and a steep slope is typically, sometimes there's two tiers. One's over 12% and one's over 20%.
And do we have like some minimum dimension for that sloped area before it becomes a steep slope area?
I don't know if that's codified.
I'm
I
looking for, I don't have all this memorized. It's beyond what I usually deal with, but I'm looking for it.
I had a colleague once who complained that the cornfield would be considered a steep slope area because
Just
of
with the furrows.
exactly. even though it could have been a completely flat plain of corn, technically, and I, it was a ridiculous example, and it meant to be.
Well, that's a good point.
I mean, the percentage slopes are good. The 10 feet doesn't seem to be ridiculous, but I just get a little concerned about how they're designated.
I'm looking for definitions in the section of the code you don't have. I'm gonna look in there. But if someone called out cornfields, that would cause my eyebrows to furrow.
Well, of course they would.
Yeah, but I know of some cornfields that have been intricate, important contributors to major flooding. I can think of a few in the past, so it isn't a ridiculous concept here.
All right, I apologize. I found, and it should be up on your screen now, the setbacks that Van de Waal had recommended in their model here.
Yeah, those are the setbacks. I think the definition of steep wooded slopes. And yeah, I'm sorry, it's such tiny type, but on page 2 of 4, section 3, it does talk about steep wooded slopes with a 12% gradient and higher in the glaciated portions of the city, 20% and higher for the driftless portion.
Yeah, and I don't think I've ever seen a minimum, a threshold width for that, David.
Yeah.
But point taken.
Well, and that only refers to steep wooded slopes. So your farm example wouldn't
I mean, steep slopes are something that we, you need to
Yeah.
protect.
Right. Right. So I'm wondering why isn't it, maybe it is in the section Mark's looking at, why don't we define it for non-wooded?
That's another good point. I mean, I think typically, Lisa, that where we're finding these areas are in greenfield or farmland, and at a certain point, it's not farmed due to the slope and, reverts to woodland, or it was never taken out of woodland.
So what our proposed code says, it first defines slope as an incline from the horizontal expressed as an arithmetic ratio of horizontal magnitude to vertical magnitude. So that's straightforward. Steep slope then is defined as steep slopes are areas which contain a ratio of horizontal magnitude to vertical magnitude of 8:1, which is a gradient of 12% or greater, but it doesn't say over what distance. So your corn rows are definitely steep slopes.
Yeah.
I would obviously not consider that steep slopes from a zoning standpoint. But I don't think there's a concept of what geographic extent constitutes a steep slope.
Yeah. We had many discussions at a town about this, and it was a question of area and question of how it was formed to a certain extent, because if it was man-made and not all that large, it didn't seem to be something to get too concerned about, but other areas certainly can be very concerning. And it just is kind of nice to have good definitions for what is going to be considered or not considered.
Is
No more
that,
comments?
is there any more comments that we, one thing, Mark, we talk about Driftless area here. I'm not sure if any of the cities in the Driftless area.
I was going to ask what
I don't
area
think
that
so.
would be.
The Black Earth Creek Divide is the Driftless area. And I don't think there's any part that's in the Driftless area.
I think you're right.
That was sort of my conclusion too. But I left it in there.
Yeah.
Is there a possibility of future annexation?
Yeah.
That would do it.
Or
If we move into Black Earth Creek, which is not, the city says no, but
well, we did just annex the land north of the golf course. And that's actually why I left this in there.
that might do it.
Yeah.
That probably did do it. And part of the golf course could be in the Driftless area.
Yeah.
You get out in the woods in the last part of it, it could well be. So I just leave it in, probably makes sense.
It doesn't hurt.
So what should we do with these comments, Mark? Is that just good enough what Eric provided you and the comments we've had?
I mean, I think this is helpful. I'm hearing that you would like to introduce the non-navigable stream areas, which was really the basic policy question he had.
Yeah.
Called out, and I have no problem with that. I think the other feedback is then just making sure we have a definition of what's at what point do you consider something a steep slope besides a corn row? So, we'll ask that question too.
Okay. So we don't need any motion or just taking our comments and Eric's comments.
I don't know how you usually write your minutes, Eric, or do you? I assume you document that type of discussion.
Yeah, we're just returning comments to staff at this point.
We didn't talk about the specific separation distances, and we also do have the shorelands and shoreland wetlands questions.
I assumed you were getting to shoreline next, but yeah, the separation distances, if you want to comment on
Yeah,
that.
is there consensus or any comment on the distances that they have spelled out in the model ordinance at this point? So 10 feet from woodland, 20 feet from steep slopes. And then we're with the same issue with navigable and non-navigable, but 50 feet from the ordinary high water mark. In which case it would have to be navigable,
Mhm.
and 30 feet from top of bank of some other type of drainage way.
Do they define what the ordinary high water mark is?
Well, that would be DNR's definition, and, you know,
Okay.
I think that ordinance is written to give that authority to the local zoning administrator, which is Mark Opitz. But I think in practice, that's always been set by the DNR. You
Yeah,
know,
I
it's
think-
you. It's usually the point where you see a vegetation break, for those of you who aren't familiar with this stuff. One of the definitions of a navigable waterway is a defined bed and bank. So it's kind of the spot where the grassed bank begins. I always think of it as about where the 1.5 year or 2 year storm would rise to.
yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. So there's no more comments on that then?
I'll add one thing, you know, the setbacks from the waterways are not anything new and would also be covered by other sections of the ordinance. The setbacks from steep slopes or woodlands or something like that would be something added that's not currently in the ordinance and wouldn't be anywhere besides this environmental corridor ordinance overlay.
Well, I can't comment on the distances and, you know, would trust that there's a basis for these numbers. They're awfully round. I'm gonna guess that,
Yeah.
you know, they're based on experience and best practices.
Oh,
Maybe I shouldn't assume that, but
Or politics?
oh, yeah. Hmm. That's a good observation there.
Okay, so are you comfortable with that, Mark and Eric, with our comments?
I think what we're hearing is maybe kick this can down the road and come back with logic for you to think about.
Let me ask you a question, because in the future, if this came up on something, and, you know, we see that this is kind of ridiculous requirement for this particular development, do we have the ability to make an exception or not? I mean, that's the difficulty of trying to put numbers in here that don't necessarily fully characterize the situation. So I'm just wondering whether there can be exemptions from the committee on a requirement.
Mark Opitz, did you hear that question? Is there a mechanism for seeking variance planned?
That's a good question in terms of, I mean, if it's in the zoning ordinance, then yes. Right now, it's not clear to me when we deal with it through land division. I mean, there is still some variance route there, but this certainly will clean it up. So I think I'm comfortable with saying yes.
Okay, good.
Okay. Do you have enough then, Eric, for making comments? We'll go on to the next topic.
Yeah, for the environmental corridors, shoreline wetlands are perhaps more complicated. So counties typically have a shoreland zoning ordinance, and cities typically do not, or it's very minimal. I think back in the 70s and 80s, I'm gonna guess when they were developing these things, the cities and villages did not want, to be bound by shoreland or lakefront ordinances. And I think that's where those two differences lie. At some point more recently, the state legislature kind of put in the same kind of restrictions they did with infiltration, where they
Yeah.
tried to limit, what a county could do with their shoreland ordinance,
Yeah.
as far as all kinds of stuff, setbacks, vegetated buffer zones. I think there's a requirement in there for lighting that was kind of neutered. So there's two different areas that we're talking about. One is what we've annexed since May 7th, maybe, of 1982, and the other is what came before that. And for the annexed areas, we're stuck with the requirements of the county ordinance that was in effect at that time. Our current, well, let me take a step back. For the other areas of the city, we could, theoretically, enact all kinds of stuff without interference from state statute, so to speak. So our current shoreland ordinance is only applicable to the annexed areas. And its only provisions are for setbacks for structures, setback for vegetation, and then I think it includes the viewing corridor provision. So let me flip to this map. Oh, good grief, where did I put that? Pardon me. So silver is what we had in 1982, or gray. And this tannish orange color is what's been annexed since. So the first question is whether we want to expand our own shoreland ordinance, to cover all the central part of the city, or if we want to leave it be and only covering the annexed areas, which is like the bare minimum that we're required to do. And then the second question gets into a lot more detail about, how do we want to change requirements and make them even more stringent?
Well, my preference would be to regulate, not based on, the statutory definition, but rather the area that is being regulated. In other words, I'd be in favor of going for simplicity and applying, if it makes sense to do it in an annexed area, why doesn't it make sense hydrologically? Why wouldn't it make sense to do it in the rest of the city?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Good point, yeah.
Me too.
May I make a comment, Warren? Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
So I think that I can't argue with that logic either, Lisa, and the rest of you. The practical implications of it are that, I'll just pick on Middleton Beach Road. We have, 10 or so houses, I don't know how many, have not been redeveloped. They were cottages. People who own those properties, I'm sure have seen what's happened with their neighbors and probably have the expectation that their property at some point will redevelop. There's going to be, I predict, an uproar to elected officials if our new zoning code does not allow them to do the same thing that their neighbors did. I will do whatever the council asks in the form of adopting the new zoning code. I'm just cautioning you that it's going to raise fairness issues. Obviously, laws can and should change over time. We are smarter now about flooding, and we know there's climate change, extreme events. We understand those things, and there are times that justify changing our laws. But I just would say from a practical standpoint, I mean, I'm just dealing with something this week. Eric knows about this, where people say they want to do what their neighbor has. And this was with the driveway installation. I mean, it's, people are, it's just going to require extensive explanation to people why this is in the public interest and in the interest of the environment. Again, happy to do that. I'm just cautioning that there's ramifications to that.
You just refer everybody to Lisa.
Pardon me?
You just refer everybody to
Refer to me.
Lisa.
Well, and I totally get that, but I mean, we're not preventing development or redevelopment. We would just be imposing or asking the homeowner to abide by the new code, right? And if if a neighbor along Middleton Beach Road who has already redeveloped, replaced the cottage with a larger structure, if they made significant changes, they'd be asked to do the same thing, correct?
Right. I mean, people are not, the big houses that are there, I doubt are ever going to be replaced with a smaller house. That's just not the way it works because of property valuation. But, I think there's obviously much more awareness too, that how we develop in our environment has major effects for not just individual lots, but for the community and for the ecosystem, right? So it still is hard to translate that for somebody to be told with the 40-foot by 100-foot lot they own, a 4,000 square foot lot, that they can't put, sandwich a house on there like their neighbors have. So like I said, we do the best we can to enforce the laws we have, and if laws don't make sense, then there's a process to change them. And we will do what your guidance is. I just, this is why this is before you for a recommendation.
So the ones who have built these new McMansions now on that road, are they going to have to make some kind of adjustments?
No.
Because of all the impervious surfaces? No.
It's just that the people that have a house that is worth less than the lot, that were the hope that they could sell it to somebody who would be able to put another, redevelop the house, their land won't be worth what it's as much, and we would have to look at reevaluating all those lots. And I think there'd be a lot of people, I think Mark makes a good point, there'd be a lot of people that basically say that we're taking value away from them. And I think there'd be a lot of people who would be quite upset.
Could the city make variances for that?
Variances are supposed to be granted on the basis of hardship. You cannot, pardon me?
That wouldn't be a hardship, would it?
No, someone's financial hardship is not a basis for granting a zoning variance.
No. Well, on the other hand, is we can make a recommendation to the city council and they could decide if we think from a water standpoint, it makes sense to be uniform. That would be our recommendation. Then the city council could decide what they want to do with it.
I agree.
And I want to emphasize, I respect, I think all of you said that you supported that approach. I totally understand that. And you're doing your role, you're playing your role as the expertise you have from a Water Resources Management Commission. I totally understand that. So I don't fault that at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's about a dozen of those properties that haven't been redeveloped. And I don't think this would prevent them from
No.
dropping in a massive house, but they would have to take steps to mitigate that. And that's, we're not anywhere near the point where I would try to give you mitigation procedures, but that's the question. This would be controversial, particularly along Middleton Beach Road.
Right, well, and you do mention, Eric, in the memo, things like pervious pavers, green roofs, and other stormwater management practices. So it's not like we're preventing someone from being able to develop their dream home on there, and somebody who can afford to do that and values the lake, would, I hope, understand that they can take these options and comply with the code and be protective of the lake and set an example.
And that's a good point.
And we should have done it a long time ago, and then are we postponing it now? And somebody's gonna say 10 years from now, well, why didn't you
Yeah.
do it 10 years ago?
That's
Yeah.
another good point, yeah.
Well, and I was wondering, when the city did the recent construction, the road reconstruction, were there additional stormwater management practices
Yeah,
incorporated into that, since it is Middleton Beach Road?
There were not, to my knowledge. There were, wetland avoidance that they had to accomplish. But, you're not required to do stormwater management for a road rehab project, and you're actually allowed quite a bit of, like widening without having to do anything extra. And then the other issue that a homeowner or the road project would have had is how do you, if you install pervious pavers, are they really gonna infiltrate any water, or is it gonna, due to a high groundwater table, is it just gonna sit and cause issues?
Either way, it's gonna get to the lake real quickly.
I
Yeah.
won't make much difference, and then you're putting a lot of costs on people that really don't have any effect.
And, part of the reasoning for these shoreline standards is not water quality or hydrology or anything. It's aesthetics of what does our lakeshore look like. It's not necessarily
Yeah,
a water resources thing.
yeah, we're commenting on the water resource portion of it though.
Yeah.
So do you need a motion on that, or just our comments good enough, Eric?
I think I can just summarize comments and forward them on to Mark.
Okay. Is there any other areas for us to talk about?
No, I think that's the end of these two things, but then I would anticipate more talk of zoning ordinance in the coming months as this starts to move through.
Okay.
Last item, Warren.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah, I thought we'd have a shorter agenda, so I added this comment on it, and it won't take long just to go through. If you could bring up the PowerPoint. Our members, we've talked about the flooding and how the South Fork and North Fork behave, but since we got some new members, I thought the August of 7th or 8th flood was a good example of a summer storm, and what this shows the differences between the South Fork and the North Fork. So the next slide. So this is a storm we had a couple of weeks ago that we had 2 bursts, a total of about 2.5 inches of rain, which is a pretty good storm, not a real large one, but and it was pretty uniform across the basin. I checked this is at the gauging station at Parmenter Street, operated by USGS. And I checked their gauge at Dorn Creek and they had about the same amount of rain. And the one in Spring Harbor had a preset gauge and they had about the same, maybe a little bit more on Dorn Creek and maybe a little less at Spring Harbor. And anyway, around 2.5 inches of rain. The next one. So this is the South Fork at Deming Way, and you can see the sharp rise that we had in discharge. Got up to, I think, 130, 140 CFS. And then we had that second peak came a little less than 100. And then you can see the rapid response because this is an urbanized basin, probably 80% urbanized. And so and also the South Fork is on there, which does mean the South Pond is on the South Fork, which does a pretty good job of reducing the flood peaks for small floods. The next one. And this is a good example of the North Fork during the summer. Is a much bigger drainage area, about 50% larger, but you can see the flood peak is about 35 CFS. And I've noticed this before, summer flood peaks, once the corn is up, the corn is a big blotter and just absorbs all the water or soybeans. And so you don't get nowhere near the flood peak that you would get during the winter period or rain on frozen ground or early spring, when the flood peaks on the North Fork are very similar to the South Fork. As an example is if the North Fork doesn't urbanize, or when it does, we don't want it to become like the South Fork. Otherwise, we're going to see a tremendous increase or a large increase on the total floods on Pheasant Branch. The next one. This is the one at the Gaydon Station at Parmenter Street. And so this is a combination of the South Fork and the North Fork. And you can see that it's about 95 or 98 CFS. And so we have a considerable reduction in the combined flood peaks, which if you combine them together, the next slide will show that. Anyway, here is the combination of flood peaks, and the green one is the South Fork, and then the blue one is the one at Parmenter Street, and then the North Fork is the red one. And you can see if we combine them at the peak time, when the gauge station at Parmenter peaked, it was, if you added the two other ones together, you would probably be around 100, 150, 160. So we have a considerable decrease. Confluence Pond does a pretty good job in reducing the flood peaks, especially for small floods. Although the study by Arrows, when it did the model, showed that the 100-year flood was reduced 35%. So the Confluence Pond does a pretty good job of reducing flood peaks, which we designed it to do. And just a good example of that illustration. Just to give you a little idea of how it compares to Spring Harbor, this is Spring Harbor, which is a drainage area of about 3 square miles, or a lot less than South Fork, and it peaked around 400 CFS. So either the South Pond is doing a better job, or they're not doing much of a job at all on Spring Harbor. Although Spring Harbor has, I believe, those 2 detention basins off Mineral Point Road take the flow from West Town, so there is some detention on the south on Spring Harbor, and then there's that one on Rosa Road at the junction of Old Middleton that does somewhat of knocking down the flood peak. But even so, this is much larger flood peak. And the next one is just a comparison to put it on CFS per square mile. As I mentioned, the North Fork is about 50% bigger than the South Fork, and you can look at peak discharges, and it's about 5 times larger on the South Fork than the North Fork. And then if you look at Spring Harbor, it's about many times larger than the North Fork. So just an example of what a summer storm looks like and how the 2 basins behave, and what might happen if you don't pay attention on the North Fork. It urbanizes. So that's it. Is there any comments?
Well, I'm surprised by those Spring Harbor numbers.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, that's on the other hand is mostly a storm sewer, and that's
really, yeah.
good hunk of it. We're on the South Fork. There's a number of detention ponds, or a couple at least, that Madison put into And then we also have to route those storms through culverts or highways, and that knocks down the flood peaks too. So
Yeah.
I think once you put it into a storm sewer, a lot happens to it.
Yeah, no, well.
So just thought it was a good comparison of interest, and we haven't had many storms lately, and I noticed behavior before. And I don't know if you look at cornfields the last few years, but they're dense. They don't have furrows or rows anymore. They're just a solid mass of corn. And I don't know when that changed their place, but I don't think you can walk through a cornfield anymore.
Hmm.
You look at them closely, I'd say it's 4 or 5 times denser than it was previously.
Wow, that's got to have an impact.
Yeah,
Of course, on the other hand, you have more roots, right? So,
yeah, you got that. And if they don't, I don't think they necessarily turn them over. So that after the
yeah, they don't do that.
harvested, probably does a better job of knocking down the flood peaks.
Yeah, no, right, yeah, I mean,
Oh, I don't know. We're talking about the North Fork. Did you notice in the paper the digesters that were in place on the Pheasant Branch and the North Fork?
Yeah.
They didn't say that, but essentially they got what, 4 digesters or 3? I can't remember. That are now operational that should take the manure from, I think, 5 dairy farms, which is maybe most of them in the headwaters. And that manure will then be taken to the digesters and change form of it and not spread on the land during the winter like it has in the past. So we should see a significant reduction in the phosphorus loads in the North Fork.
that's
Warren, are you talking about the ones on Schneider Road, or is there something new that's happened?
I don't know. I think it's on Schneider Road, but I think is it one plant or is it a couple?
It's called, isn't it called NTech or something? I think it's.
Yeah,
NTech.
right.
When
Yeah,
I was
they-
there in the spring, they had 3 operating and they were taking manure from 4 dairy farms. So it sounds like maybe they got the 4th one up and running and now they have 5 farms,
Yeah.
or maybe their process just improved.
That's great.
Talking about right there.
Mm-hmm.
And
So-
the Wagners were still not pumping over to the digester last I heard, which was
They're
part of
big.
the original plan.
Yeah. That's a
And I
good
think,
sign.
I don't know offhand, Warren, but I think Blue Star, which is right here, was supplying manure.
Yeah, they are.
And well, David, maybe you know, is this in Pheasant Branch watershed?
I think it is,
I
but
think it's for close if it's not. Yeah.
yeah.
Looks like it might be,
Does
And then,
DCI map have watersheds?
yeah, but I'm not on DCI map.
Yeah, well, okay, I think it is. I think it is.
I think
Wagner's wanted their manure back so they could spread it, which would sort of defeat the whole phosphorus issue.
Right.
Yeah,
So
I
it
heard-
was these 3, Ziegler, Wagner, Blue Star, and then I think the 4th was maybe these folks over here.
That's, I know
Hanson.
when I walk the dogs at the dog park, I could see a farm out there. They were always have spread manure in the past. That's probably them.
I think that was Ziegler.
Yeah.
But this has been up
Anyway.
and running for a few years now, Warren, quite a
Yes.
few.
So we should have noticed some decrease when, last year and this year have been, we haven't had any large storms, so the phosphorus loads are down. Yeah. A good thing we have, 10 years of records, so we should be able to see some trends taking place. So it'd be nice to see some positive reduction from this operation. I think
yeah,
we should
absolutely.
be able to see it. I know Todd Stundbeck said if we ever have to stop funding that, I think they would be interested in finding funding from some other source.
Well,
Okay.
we should stop funding it then.
Well, there's never any assurance on that.
Yeah,
I think adaptive management would like to look at it because they're looking at as part of the adaptive management zone.
Mhm.
Okay. Any other comments? If not, we'll call the meeting adjourned.
Okay,
Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
thank you, everybody.
All right, good job.
Goodbye.
Good night.
Good night.
Yep.